Welcome to Beyond the Fear, a space for rebels and dreamers, healers and soul seekers, light workers and rule breakers, artists and creators who are ready to break free from fear and live a life that turns them on. Hey, I'm Nadine Zomot, and in my early 20s, I broke free from an oppressive culture in the Middle East that was suffocating my free spirit and denying me the ability to follow my intuition. I now embrace a life that exceeds my wildest imagination, and my mission is to guide you to do the same. My unique method brings together practical aspects of money coaching, energetics, trauma and nervous system healing, spirituality, and inner child work. And as a result, my clients are now able to follow their desires and tap into the richness of life, elevating not just themselves, but also their communities. This podcast is about integrating and healing our shadow parts to amplify our essence and live life guided by our intuition. My guests and I will be sharing our stories and wisdom to help guide you to embracing and living life passionately, because there's nothing sexier in life than a person who embraces their authentic power. The world needs you to show up as you, in your power, in your authenticity, your imperfections, your rebellion, and in your truth. Because if this little girl from Jordan can do it, so can you. So now, what about you? What's waiting for you beyond the fear? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Fear podcast. I am your host, Nadine Zomot, and today with me, I've got Leigh Ann Tahami. Leigh Ann is a natural wellness practitioner, EVOX practitioner, and a flower essence specialist. She helps clients break free from emotional and behavioral patterns so that they may live their most joyful, peaceful, authentic lives. She plays the detective, sifting through and helping clients release protective programming, repressed emotions, and personal and generational trauma. Her root cause approach blends a variety of modalities, including EVOX therapy, somatic experiencing, nervous system support, and flower essences. Welcome, Leigh Ann. I'm so excited to have you on. I love your podcast, and I'm quite intimidated having you as a guest.
My gosh.
Me interviewing you, I mean. So, hi.
I'm so excited. I've loved our past interviews on my show, and I just feel like I'm getting ready to chat to a friend. I couldn't wait for this.
Oh, I will put a link to the episodes that we've done together on your podcast in the show notes so that people can actually nerd out on these as well, because I think they were great interviews.
Oh, they were so good. I mean, even as I go back and was editing them, I was eating it up, like as if I had heard it for the first time. They were so good. Beautiful. And you're so fun and wonderful to have on.
Thank you. Thank you, Leigh Ann. So are you. So let's get started. I like to ask this question, everybody that comes through and I interview, what turns you on in life?
I mean, there's so many things. I love helping others have their own little epiphanies. So I honestly, even when I was like 10 years old, I loved talking with friends and family about, why do you think you feel that way? And why do you think like you do act in this certain way? I loved piecing those things together. So just kind of like helping others, being a mirror for others, as well as growing myself. That's kind of like the broad thing. One of the things I love, but I also there's so many little hobbies that I have: soccer, sports, outdoors, nature, all of those different things.
Oh, yay. That's nice. I love nature so much. It's so yummy, isn't it?
Oh, it's the best.
I love it. Feels so different when you're indoors versus outdoors. Like the ideas that come to me when I'm outdoors, I always tell my husband, like, I don't think I would have thought of that or came up with this awesome epiphany if I were in the house or any house, really.
It's so true. When I'm feeling stuck, I honestly know I've got to get outside and I've got to move. So I tend to, especially if I'm mulling over something really deep, I go for like an hour, 2-hour walk outside until I've gotten to the end of it. And it works every time, I'm telling you.
I think your walks inspired me because we've been in winter here in Australia. And I always look at Instagram and you're always posting about your long walks. I'm like, I want to go on long walks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, this is something I'm going to start doing as soon as we get a little bit of sun, which we don't today, but it's okay. All good.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
good. So were you always like this? Were you always this lit up and turned on about life?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess there's maybe two ways that I could answer it. On the one hand, I always had what I would say is a vibrancy. I always was excited about what was going on in life, excited about the things I was pursuing, connecting. But what I would say, I think it's interesting because anyone else in my life might have been like, yes, she is very driven and passionate. But when you say like, were you always this lit up? The thing that comes up in my mind is I had a very hard time expressing excitement.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure we're going to get into this when we start talking about the nervous system because it's all connected. But I say that because internally I felt so much passion. And even as a young child, like, this is amazing that we're here. What a beautiful world. My God, I love myself so much. How cool that I get to be me and all those things. But I don't think it quite translated so much to the world around me. It was all very internal. And when I did feel something or was excited about something that was really, really big and wonderful, I would have a hard time even feeling that fully within myself, but especially expressing it externally.
Got it. So did you want to be in the wellness field, or what did you want to be when you were young? You know, when they ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up?
I'm sure there were some typical answers in there. I'd have to ask my mom to get some of those specifics, but I always wanted to be in some kind of service helping industry. And so ultimately I ended up majoring in public health.
Oh, wow.
I was always fascinated with wellness and physiology, anatomy. I almost double majored in psychology and public health because I'm just also so fascinated, but I was playing soccer for my university, so it was just too much. But ever since graduating, I felt like I was looking for the thing that was going to be, this is the way I help people. And ultimately public health wasn't really my zone because it's a lot of mass scale programs that we're implementing and studying. Ended up not really being my jam, but I was like, I know I'm meant to help people. I know it's such a passion and maybe even a gift of mine, but I haven't been able to quite land on what is that thing that it's like, oh yeah, I do this. Even though I never wanted to be just like one thing. But, I'd come across like, oh, maybe I could do acupuncture. Maybe I could do naturopathy. And I still dabble in a lot of those things because I'm just an avid learner. But ultimately, when I was introduced to EVOX therapy through my own health journey and my own healing journey, that was the thing that after experiencing it for a bit and seeing how much it changed my life, I was like, oh, this is the tool I was meant to use.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So what led you down the path of being, of doing what you're doing now? Because it's such a unique combination of modalities. And like you as well, like I majored in nutrition. I did my master's in food science. And then I was like, okay, now what? That's not what I want to be doing. I want to be doing this and this and this and this, and I want to help people with this. So I went down a very meandering path to actually reach to money coaching, which really isn't financial coaching. It's more, about our behaviors, and we will get into the nervous system. And also it is detective work. It is about finding these core wounds, which we will be talking about later on. But yeah, tell us about how you found EVOX, how you created this unique combination of the things that you practice and help people with.
What started it for me is, as I was learning more and more about health, I was pursuing a lot more alternative holistic medicine. I started to realize even this physiological side of health isn't solving everyone's problems. You could have the perfect diet, the perfect workout regime, and still I was seeing people being so unhappy, filled with anxiety. And ultimately it led to my philosophy on health, on life. And it's just that we really need to be looking at physical health, emotional health, and spiritual health.
Yes.
To hopefully achieve our most optimal state of being, our most joyful, peaceful, authentic selves. That's what I love to say.
Yeah.
And so it started for me with that physiological side, studying nutrition and naturopathy. I'm still in the middle of my traditional naturopathic doctor program. So I'm still pursuing that and continuing to learn more. But the EVOX ties in so deeply to my healing journey because in 2020, I was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer at 24 years old.
Goodness. Okay.
And I was so lucky and so blessed to be, I'm here in Southern California, and I was introduced to a doctor, Dr. Leigh Ann Lindsey in Irvine, and she's a cancer doctor. She's a standard MD, but she brings in a much more alternative, a much broader approach, really a full body, full being approach. And every cancer patient at their center, they have them do this thing called EVOX therapy. Mm-hmm. And it's really all about the emotional wellness. And because Dr. Keneally is so intent on educating individuals that when there's cancer, there is always an emotional component.
Oh my God. Finally, somebody's saying it out loud. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And it was so true for me. Now, I had always considered myself a pretty introspective person. Like I said earlier, I loved to analyze my behavior. Why am I doing this? Why do I like this? Could I change this? Mm-hmm. But something I learned so deeply in that experience, and I see it again and again now as I work with clients, is we can trick ourselves into thinking that just because we don't think about past experiences anymore, that they're no longer affecting us.
Yeah. Sweep them under the rug. They're no longer, if you can't see them, they're not there. So
right. True. And so I had done a lot of processing around my childhood and the environment and my parents and all those different things. But I think I had kind of gone like, oh yeah, I see how that affected me. Mm-hmm. And I'm working through it and it's not that big of a deal. The EVOX really broke all that open and showed me there are so many other things. There are so many other ways your past affected you, but also is still affecting you, that is ingrained in your body. And for me, it was a lot of, there's so many unprocessed, unresolved emotions and experiences that are demanding to be looked at. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I did EVOX therapy among so many other treatments and tests and modalities at the Cancer Center. And it really, truly changed my life. Wow. And helped me get through that time, but also helped me process some of the things from my past that I had thought were kind of done and sealed up with and over with. And it made such an amazing impact on my life. So fast forward about a year, I was like, man, it's so amazing. But I was still feeling like I was still searching. And it's so funny because it hadn't, and all of that time, it hadn't once dawned on me that maybe this was the thing. This was the thing I was meant to do. Uh-huh. Right. And so then come January, like a year later, it was just like an epiphany for me, like, oh, I could do this. I could offer this to other people. And so, I mean, truly within 2 months, I had bought the technology. I had gone through their training, become certified, registered my LLC, and like opened my business.
Amazing. So it's funny when things are meant to be, they just flow, huh?
Oh my gosh. It's so true.
Yeah.
It's just there's an ease to it. Yeah.
Yeah. That ease, that like quality of the flow, it just feels easy. And one thing leads to another. And all of a sudden within like weeks, because what's 2 months? It's 8 weeks, really.
Yeah.
Done.
Totally.
All good. Yeah. Perfect.
And I have to give so much credit to my husband because I tend to be a slow mover, a slow to change, although I'm working on it and I'm getting better. But in my mind, I was like, oh, maybe over the next year or two, I'll get certified and get into this. And he was like, what are you talking about? Like, we're getting it, do this. Yeah. And then boom, 2-3 months later, there's a business. I'm looking for office spaces. So,
wow.
And it has been like 2 of the best years of my life. I feel so content, so happy, so fulfilled. And I mean, every single day as I'm driving in, I'm like, I cannot believe that I get to do this. I might change someone's life today. So.
Oh, I love that. I might change someone's life today. Oh my God, that's so awesome. So tell us about EVOX. What is EVOX?
Yes. So EVOX is not new. It has been around for many years now, but it's still, every single person I talk to goes, I've never heard about this. So it's a combination of two different technologies. And I'll explain a little bit more of what the sessions look like. But ultimately, the technology of EVOX involves something called voice mapping and then biofeedback. And so what we're doing with the voice mapping is we know that when someone is talking, when all of us are talking all day long, there's tones in our voice that correlate to emotions. Now, we can't maybe necessarily pick out, oh, that's like the frequency of 550 hertz. That correlates to anger or whatever it might be. But the system can pick up those tones. And so what we're doing is the clients will come in, we'll put on a headset, and as they talk about a specific topic that they're wanting to sift through or process or release, we're measuring the tones in their voice to see what emotions are imbalanced in relation to that topic. The biofeedback part of EVOX is where we then output through the system into the body the frequencies that have been found to help support the release and the balancing of those emotions.
Wow, that sounds awesome.
So that's the nitty gritty of it. And it still probably sounds very kind of technological and this and that.
Wow.
But what we'll do when we're in a session is the client will have the headphones on. They'll have their hand on what we call the hand cradle. And that's the biofeedback device. And we just go through a series of rounds of getting a little audio recording. And then we go into a biofeedback for maybe 2 or 3 minutes where we're outputting balancing frequencies. Then we get a new recording to see what shifted. And so we go back and forth like that. But what I like to say is, okay, this is the technology. Now, how does it actually help us? Because there may not be such an obvious connection in the minds. And so the primary way that I've used EVOX with clients is there's 3 main ways. One is it's amazing for phobias and breaking that connection in the brain related to phobias, that coupling that the subconscious makes between this thing and danger. It's also amazing for more acute periods of stress or trauma. Maybe there was a death in the family. Maybe you were in a car accident. Maybe you have a big project at work coming up and you just need a little extra support, releasing and balancing those emotions in that time. But I'd say the primary way that I use it is for diving in deeper into the past experiences, the beliefs that are being held in the subconscious mind that were created from past experiences, and how those are feeding into patterns that we feel stuck in. So usually someone will come in and we'll go, okay, what are you feeling like what's the pattern you're stuck in? And for some, it's, I feel stuck in overeating. I feel stuck in money habits that I can't break through. And so we start to use EVOX to dive into, okay, what were the experiences? What are the subconscious beliefs? What are the core wounds that are all contributing to this pattern? Because one of the things I love to say is we all know we shouldn't be doing things.
Oh yeah.
We know we shouldn't be overeating, overspending, not moving our body, dating this person who's unemotionally available, all those things. But just because we know it doesn't mean we can do it. And so if you have consciously known you need to make a shift in your life, but you have not been able to, that is such a clear sign for me that you have a subconscious belief that for some reason your mind needs to keep this pattern in place, whether it's protective or soothing. And so that's what we're trying to do with EVOX, is start to figure out, what are the subconscious beliefs feeding this? What are the experiences that created those beliefs? What emotions need to be released? And then also modeling to the subconscious what a new behavior could look like. So there's a lot of different phases we go through, but that's the key main way that I use EVOX.
That's amazing. And I could see how EVOX can literally change somebody's life.
Well, it's so profound because I've done therapy, I've done EMDR. I know clients who've done years and years and years of so many different things, hypnotherapy, and those are all amazing and they all have their place. I think they're so important. But I'm starting to see that because trauma in particular, adverse experiences have a very real physiological effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when we are in therapy, for example, we're pretty much just working from the conscious mind. And unfortunately, what happens is when we're talking about something that was traumatizing or scary or uncomfortable from the conscious mind, all of those danger signals start to go off, and then we tend to shut down.
Yeah.
And I think that's why therapy tends to be something that people are in for such a long time, because when we get into some kind of stress response, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, fawn, we can't even think clearly. And so we're trying to process things in therapy. And I think sometimes we start hitting a wall because we're truly shutting down. We're not,
we're
our brain
truly shut down. Yeah.
Yes.
Physiologically, your neocortex is like offline, no more.
Yes.
And I totally agree with you. Like, people come to me. I've had clients that have been in therapy for decades. Like, I have older clients and decades, like 20, 30 years. And within a few sessions, because the method that I use for the subconscious beliefs is not as technologically advanced as EVOX, but I do have a method that just it really shows what are the underlying core wounds that create these patterns that they don't want. Yeah. So from your experience, what adverse situations create unhealthy money patterns with yourself, for example, and with the client that you've been seeing?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think I'm going to quote Dr. Gabor Mate in what he says, that trauma isn't what happened to you, it's what happened inside of you.
Yeah.
And it's so, so true. But I'd say what I see often at the root of money problems is fear, shame. For me, it was grief.
Okay.
For me, it was grief. And do you want me to get into some of my specific ways that it was showing up?
Yeah, sure. We can dive into that.
Because then I think I can pair off of that really well. So I had several different patterns related to money that, in doing EVOX with myself and doing so much processing around it, even the different money habits I had different roots.
Wow. Okay.
So for example, I'll just kind of outline the different patterns that I felt stuck in with money. I felt stuck in a pattern of feeling selfish and sinful and shameful for having more than enough money. I felt stuck in a pattern that I'll never be able to understand money well.
Okay.
I felt stuck in a pattern of I'm so overwhelmed and fearful to even look at my money. So I wasn't looking at my bank account. I wasn't monitoring credit cards. I was just completely dissociated from it. And then really stuck in a pattern of overspending.
Yeah.
And overspending in relation to food in particular. But what I started to piece together as I'm doing my detective work for myself is the shame around money and the shame around debt and feeling kind of sinful about having too much, feeling shameful about having debt. For me, those were rooted in a religious upbringing.
Wow. Okay.
And the messaging I was hearing from the communities we were a part of, that you need to give extra. You need to, if you have too much, then you must not be giving enough.
Wow.
And for some reason in the circles I grew up in, there was such a heavy shame around debt. So that's sort of like one sector of my patterns around money that had a really clear root in religious trauma. The other sector was this overspending in relation to, and for me, it was overspending with food. And it's not like I was making these huge, massive purchases, like buying expensive clothes or bags or expensive trips. It was just like, I needed food to soothe me.
Yeah.
And I think when we're talking about core wounds, which we'll probably dive into so much more, I realized that this pattern in particular of why do I feel such a need to buy food when I'm feeling uneasy. But then also, even when I'm feeling okay, I feel like, oh, I'm going to miss out if I don't get this. I have to buy this thing right now. And what I realized is this pattern in particular, the overspending with food, was so related to a core wound of mine that had a lot of grief attached to it. And so on the one hand, when I was upset and dysregulated, I would buy food to soothe my system.
Yeah.
But because of this well of grief, and I mean such a well of grief, I had this, I know, but I feel so free now and so much peace in looking at it, you know?
Yeah, your face looks very liberated. Let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm.
And so I realized that because I had this well of grief from this unprocessed, unresolved past trauma, mm-hmm. I had a belief that joy is finite and I'm trying to make up for this well of grief. Mm-hmm. So any opportunity at joy, I need to take advantage of and seize it. And again, this for me was particularly with food. So the way that it would play out is, let's say I'm going to a new city that I love, and there's a couple like coffee shops and restaurants that I love, but I had lunch before I went, so I'm not even hungry. I would still feel such a compulsion that, oh, well, I'm not here that often. And so I have to go like get my favorite coffee and my favorite lunch at this spot and my favorite dessert at this spot. It was almost like a panicky feeling and truly a compulsion that I could not say no to, even though it's like, I'm not hungry. I don't need this. So that was a big way. And that was a big thing that I felt so trapped in.
Yeah. Wow. And that just goes to show that when we have wounding around money, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to do with a particular financial situation that we grew up in or faced as children. It really can revolve around a lot of things that have to do with survival, with that finite happiness you were saying, because, that grief created this scarcity and happiness within you. And that created such a response where you would feel like you have to grasp at every moment and everything that would help you anchor in joy. And that looked like eating and spending all that money on food, even though you really weren't hungry. You were psychologically hungry. Mm-hmm. So just for whoever's listening out there, like when you find yourself having unhealthy patterns around money and you want to trace them back to your core wounds, just maybe expand your memories to things that are not literally related to money, because it's all interrelated.
Yes. Mm-hmm. There's two questions I love to ask clients when we're in sessions, or have them ask themselves, because they start to learn how to see these things.
Yeah.
And that can be so helpful in starting to identify what might be some of the roots, the emotional roots of this pattern. And it's one, how does this pattern potentially protect me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. If I didn't have this pattern, what might I be feeling or experiencing?
Yeah.
Either internally or externally. Or number two, how does this pattern soothe me? And they're they go hand in hand, but sometimes there can be a clear distinction between this is purely protective. The subconscious will feel in danger.
Yeah.
If I don't have this.
Feel like death. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it's more about just soothing. Like, I know I'm safe, but I'm kind of feeling distraught or overwhelmed. And this pattern gives me some kind of soothing. And then sometimes they're coupled together. It's soothing and it's protection.
Yeah.
But it can be so helpful to do a meditation, do some breath work, and then start to ask those questions. And you might be so surprised with what comes up.
Yeah. So when we think about like that scarcity pattern, okay, and we think about how it protects us. So the thing is, what I really disagree with in this self-development, personal development, growth world that we're living in these days is that they use the term limiting beliefs, limiting patterns. And when we, label something that we do as a protective or a soothing mechanism as limiting, we are literally just saying, you're bad, go away. We are further fragmenting parts of ourselves, further shaming a part of ourselves into going deeper and deeper into the shadows. However, when we look at things from that perspective of how is this pattern or behavior soothing me or protecting me, that coaxes that pattern out of the shadows into the light to be looked at, examined, and look at the lessons and the wisdom that this pattern has been wanting to provide, because your body, your psyche does not create patterns out of like nothing. There is a reason behind every single behavior that you do, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, right? So we don't question the healthy behaviors. However, there are behaviors out there. They are also protective mechanisms. They're coping mechanisms, but they are socially acceptable, right? But they are still not looked at because they're not considered as limiting behaviors by society. But it just depends on the person. It depends how that behavior is helpful or unhelpful, because whatever it is, so that scarcity, for example, it served you at some point in your life. It served you in the past, but right now it is quite limiting. It is quite, stopping you from progressing with your finances or progressing with your spiritual journey, right? Therefore, it needs to be examined and looked at, not from like, oh, you're bad, but from like, how are you protecting me? So what was it protecting you from?
I think certainly the overspending with money was protecting me from the grief, or really, maybe it was soothing the grief.
Yeah.
And again, there was such a clear image in my mind of, I have this well, it's so deep, and I just need to grasp at anything to kind of put that in that well and hopefully fill it up someday. But of course, it's just a void until we address that deeper wound. But something I noticed specifically is I think the overspending with money was a soother and a protector for me, because I think at some point in my life, I probably just found I love good food. It makes me so happy.
Yeah.
And so then the brain makes a positive connection with that of good food equals joy. So when I'm stressed or overwhelmed or whatever, and I need to be picked up, oh, here's something I can turn to.
Yeah.
But it got really nuanced for me because in my early childhood, my parents divorced when I was young. I think I was truly 4 or 5 years old. But I was so aware of it. And unfortunately, what kind of happened is my mom remarried. And in that home, it was very stable financially. We had a home, a backyard in the suburbs. We did sports. But my dad never could figure things out financially. And of course, he has his own trauma that I can understand now into those patterns. It doesn't justify it, but I understand it better. But it was such a sharp contrast because with my mom, we'd be in this, very average standard home. It was clean. We had good food. And then my dad would pick us up in his car that, had a broken window that was covered over with tape.
Yeah.
We'd go to his trailer. We'd go home to his trailer park and maybe have like a burger from Jack in the Box or some refried like beans and hot dogs that he'd heat up for us. The trailer was an absolute mess. The sink is piled over with dishes. And so there was just so much. It was I didn't realize even until recently how traumatizing those weekends with him were. How powerless I felt, how unseen I felt.
Oh, yeah. And the contradiction between your two homes,
Well, I thank God that I had that, because I think without that, my life might have gone in a much more destructive direction. I think that sliver of stability,
of course,
helped counteract a lot of that trauma. But what I realized is, in the weekends with Dad, we didn't eat well. We lived in this really dirty, grungy, unsafe area, but also the entire weekend was about him. He was completely incapable of connecting emotionally in any way. And so we usually spent the entire weekend, he's a carpenter, with him on a job site, building a home, hammering nails into a wood board. Sometimes he would drop us off with strangers. We had no idea. And he'd tell us he was coming back at 6 and he'd come back at 9 at night.
Whoa, that's scary. Yeah.
And so, and we're with complete strangers for hours and hours. And I just realized that ultimately that led me to feel incredibly unsafe and unseen, unheard, and unprotected.
Yeah.
And what I realized is when I would buy myself food, it made that inner child feel seen and heard and cared for.
Yeah.
And so it was the overspending with food was so deeply connected to those experiences as a child. And it was so key because what I realized is, and I think we've talked about this before, I could have just looked at this habit with my spending with food and gone, okay, I'm just going to like white knuckle through it and not do it and be super disciplined.
Yeah.
But what I like to point out is the wound that pattern is trying to protect or soothe is still there festering. Exactly. And so the subconscious is ultimately just going to shift to some new pattern.
Yes, it's
to
going to
try
shift
and soothe and protect.
Exactly. That is such a good point. Like the whole, oh yeah, but just go on a diet. Duh, go on a budget. No, these are really beautiful, superficial Band-Aid approaches to a wound that's always going to be there. And like you said, that's so wise that if you do white knuckle it, if you do override it through a strategy, it's going to find another way to show itself.
It reminded me of something I was thinking of a little earlier in the interview when you were talking about how we can have multiple different patterns that all have the same root.
Yeah.
And what I want to say to that, and this is my philosophy on it, my theory on it, is the soul, the body, our inner child demands to be heard.
Yes.
And so I really believe that if we have a core deep wound that is being repressed, unresolved, unreleased, initially we'll have like maybe one pattern that our mind is using to soothe that wound or protect us. But if we continue to not process that thing and it just continues to fester, it's almost like, I think the closest comparison I can give is maybe like alcoholism or addiction, where now what used to soothe us so good isn't doing it anymore. We need something more. We need another soother and another soother. And that's how I believe one core wound can then manifest over the years into so many different patterns. Because, for example, for me, let's say I hadn't addressed this. Right now, I'm soothing it and protecting myself with buying myself really yummy, tasty food. But 10 years from now, it might have expanded into buying myself really expensive clothes or maybe an affair. Who knows? But the point is that root wound is still going to be festering. It's still going to be bleeding and seeping. Yeah. And we're going to need more and more and more to quiet that inner voice that's just screaming.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's so beautifully put. And I see that with myself. I see that with clients. It's real. It's a real issue. And unfortunately, most information out there is about that Band-Aid approach. It doesn't really give you the tools or give us space to actually go in, like that. Understanding your core wounds, it takes time. It's not pretty. And I often say that no matter how good of a practitioner you are, how good of a therapist or a space holder or a coach or whatever, you need to be given that safe space by somebody else to process these core wounds, because they're so embedded deeply and they hurt when they come out, and you need to be held. And that is something that changed me a lot, because I couldn't bring them out on my own. Because that safety, I couldn't give myself the safety that I was never given as a child. And that's one thing I'd like to go down the road of when we have clients that have had seemingly normal childhoods, they feel guilty about having emotions that are, negative around their upbringing, because they know that their parents did their best. Right. So it's like this controversy within them between like feeling and knowing, you know? So, oh, I feel really bad about this because my parents did their best, but oh, I don't have any issues. I don't know why I'm like this, because we had food on the table and a roof on our heads. So going back to Dr. Mate's definition of trauma, it is about what's happening inside of you, but it is also about what you didn't receive, right?
Yeah.
So what can you tell us more about that?
Well, I've seen this multiple times where there's almost a guilt, but a guilt towards the parents of they held their parents in such high esteem.
Yeah.
And so they didn't want to address these patterns because they didn't want to have to say, oh, maybe my parent did something wrong. And what I want to point out here is most parents really do give their best. Of course, there's parents who are actively abusive and they're acting from their own trauma. Again, it doesn't justify it, but looking back on our history and going, oh, because my father never gave me any verbal affirmation, although he did so many other amazing, wonderful things. Yeah. Me acknowledging that thing that was missing for me caused all of this that's going on, or caused this piece of what's going on. Yeah. Is not me saying he's a bad person. Yeah. Is not me saying that my childhood was horrible. And so kind of taking out that coupling of, if I acknowledge that something wasn't quite right for me, it's me also negating the good. We can address the bad and the pain and the hardship, and it doesn't negate the good. In fact, what I've seen so often is the more we process of the past, actually clients will start to go, you know what? I forgot how good this was. Yeah. And this and this. And so it actually frees them to embrace and enjoy the goodness so much more.
Yeah. I keep hearing that, like, Nadine, I didn't imagine this would happen, but I think it's because of your program. But my relationship with my parents is now better, even though I was scared of going down that road. I'm like, yeah, of course. You know, we look at our relationship with our childhood, not from a blame perspective, but from like, what are the root causes or what are the root wounds that are creating these things that we've been talking about. And another thing is sometimes it's what we internalize from our perspective as children, right? So you're a child, you have limited tools, you're not that mature yet. And the way that you look at things from that perspective is part of your conditioning. These things remain with you. So, for example, me, my dad loved watching the news or loved watching soccer matches. And if I were to like, Dad, this is what happened at school, and I'm so excited to tell him, and he just shuts me, he shuts me off because he's concentrating on something. I would probably, I know I did. I internalized that as, whatever I say is not as important as the news. I am not important. I am not acknowledged. So as an adult, it really manifested itself as a difficulty of expressing myself because, like Dad never listened to me. Mom listened. That was great. But at the time, my dad wanted to watch news. And I'm not saying he should have done things differently. Maybe he should have, but it's not up to the parents 100%. It's also looking at how you might have internalized things from that perspective of a child, and then those are the foundations of your beliefs.
Yeah. Well, I think this is what's so helpful in helping release us from the guilt. Yeah. But I think parents can be educated and learn a lot from this as well, because they could have been the best parent possible, but something happened and that child internalized it in a certain way. But if both the child and the parent can start to learn that, I might have done my absolute best and felt like I gave them a great childhood, but this thing that I did caused my son to believe this thing about himself, which has then manifested into these patterns. And in acknowledging that, it's not me saying I was a horrible parent. It's not me having to say that I fucked up. I just think there's maybe like almost too much weightiness on it. Now I do, of course there are people who are abusive parents and are not giving their
Absolutely.
best and are taking great advantage of. But I think what's key here is you don't necessarily need to experience what might be categorized as trauma to create a limiting belief that then extends into the rest of your life. But I think this was tricky for me, and where my definition of trauma might be a little bit different, because I definitely agree with Gabor Mate in that it doesn't really matter what exactly happened. It's how you internalized it. It's the beliefs you created. So, for example, let's say you had a wonderfully peaceful life, but one time your mother got incredibly angry and maybe she slapped you. Right. One slap one time in your life. I don't think any psychologist is categorizing as trauma, but that one experience might have created any number of beliefs in your little child brain of, oh, I'm not safe. Oh, I can't speak my mind, or mom will get mad, or people are volatile and unpredictable. So, I mean, it could result in so many different things, but being able
I'm
to
stupid,
go,
I'm bad,
so many things. But when we start to recognize extremely quote unquote traumatic events that any of us would look at and go, that is traumatic, can create any number of subconscious beliefs that manifest into patterns. But also, if your childhood environment or your caretakers did something that created a belief in you, even if it's not necessarily like a big T or a little t trauma, it's okay for you to say, this happened and affected me in this way.
Yes, it's absolutely
it doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be a quote unquote trauma for you to feel justified in saying, yes, but it affected me this way.
Yeah, that's why I use the word wound sometimes, because, it kind of creates a disservice when people are like, no, I'm not traumatized. But when we kind of soften it and use the word wound, they're like, oh, maybe I'm a little bit wounded. Just a little bit wounded.
Yes.
So let's talk about the link between money and the nervous system.
Oh gosh. Okay. There's so many things I could say here. So where do you want to start?
Start from the top.
Well, for anyone who's not familiar with the nervous system controls so much of our body. And I'm not going to get like super into the nitty gritty of the central nervous system, peripheral, autonomic, all those different things, because I think we just get lost in that. But really, the nervous system controls so many different things: our breathing, our thinking, our heart rate, our hormones. And so when our system gets dysregulated because of past experiences, because of any number of reasons, we go into a certain stress state, I'll say. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? These are most people are familiar. We say fight or flight again and again. And those are categorized under hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is where we start to have physiological responses like increased heart rate, rapid breathing, maybe our cortisol's jumping up. Think of that more like active stress state, the fight and the flight. And then the freeze and the fawn are part of hypoarousal, where instead of getting kind of worked up and hot and tense, we get very lethargic and low. Our heart rate actually drops. Our breathing drops. We get that brain fog. All those different things. But what I have found, and I've started to integrate more and more nervous system support and techniques into my therapy for clients to do at home, is because we all tend to have a core wound that is associated with a core nervous system stress response. And so I'll just get really clear and share mine, which is my core wound is being sexually abused at 3 years old. And in the moment of the abuse, my body, for whatever reason, chose to go into a freeze stress response, complete shutdown, complete dissociation. And I really believe that what tends to happen is the mind goes, okay, that strategy got me through that experience. And so it tends to be the stress state that the body defaults to from then on. And I've seen that with myself time and time again, where the dissociation, that freeze stress state tends to be where I go. anytime I'm experiencing discomfort or fear or agitation or a fight, an argument with my spouse, I start to dissociate right away.
That's the default nervous system response. Well, first of all, I'm sorry that happened to you. That's awful. And it is quite important to kind of look at our default nervous system response. Mine used to be flight, and it progressed, it progresses from going from hyperarousal. Sometimes if you continue on, your system shuts down into hypoarousal. So mine went from a flight response, and I just see it plummeting down into a freeze response. So I go from like, I got to run away, or I got to do something to stop feeling uncomfortable, to like, okay, I give up. I feel helpless.
Well, and what I would even say is, and this is speculative, obviously it's not, it could resonate or not. I would say that dissociative response, that freeze response, might actually be your true core response.
Could be. Yeah.
And I love that we're talking about this, because I've seen this in myself as well. And this is something I saw you posted, Call of the Wild, that you're reading.
Yeah.
And she talked about this in her book, where when we have a really narrow window of tolerance, basically that window where the stressors that are coming at us, we're able to manage and remain sort of in a calm, cool, collected, safe place.
Yeah.
When we have a narrow window of tolerance, stimuli, any kind of stimuli, whether it's good or bad, can throw us out of that window because it's just too much for our system to handle.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is a hyperarousal state, like fight or flight, can be too much to handle. It's too much on our nervous system, that quickened breathing, that heightened anxiety, that to protect us from that, we go into that freeze response. And so that's why I would say the freeze might actually be your core one, because it's defaulting to, this sort of like kind of fluttery, uncomfortable, agitated feeling is too much for me. I have to protect from that. Boom.
I see.
I dissociate.
Yeah. That's a good point, actually. Speaking of the window of tolerance, so the thing is, like, we don't always want to be in like, untriggered. Triggers happen, right? But it's the flexibility of your nervous system of going from that hyper or hypoarousal back to that regulated state. But that's what we're aiming for. It's the flexibility, not being ever triggered. That Zen, that image of that Zen monk that never is triggered, that really doesn't work for me or my clients. And I know that for you as well, it's not what you're after. You want to be aroused. You want to feel things, right? So it's like going back into the regulation, that flexibility is the goal.
Yes. Well, there's a couple of things I want to say to that. The first is the freeze stress response can be that person who never seems perturbed is just so, or they're very neutral.
Yeah.
You never see them get angry or yell, but you also realize like, I also never see them get like super, super excited.
Yeah.
That can be a sign of a freeze.
Absolutely.
A freeze stress response, because any feeling that's too much, whether it's too much joy, too much excitement, or too much anger, is overwhelming for them. And so they stay in a very neutral place. And so I actually noticed with myself that I have a very hard time getting too excited, showing too much excitement. I tend to be in a little bit more of a neutral place. And I know other people in my life as well. And it's a sign that they have a very small window of tolerance.
Yeah.
But, go ahead.
No, I was going to circle back to what you said at the beginning of the episode of where, your problem when you were a kid was that you had so much joy inside of you, but you weren't able to express that outwards. And I was wondering if you want to, kind of explain from a nervous system perspective of how that looks like.
How working through that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to, this ties into it so well, is trauma, adverse experiences, wounding affects our nervous system in two ways. So the first is that it narrows our window of tolerance so that maybe the littlest thing throws us into a certain stress state. the surprise phone call we get from a friend who didn't tell us they were calling is like, oh no, like that throws us into one of those places. Either it's that hyper arousal or the hypo arousal. And so our tolerance for what stimuli and stressors we can experience while remaining calm and safe become very, very little. Mm-hmm. The other way it affects us, though, is that when we do become dysregulated, we're in that hypo or hyperarousal state, it can take us so long to get back into the safe
less
zone.
Flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are two very distinct things. And this is what I love seeing shift with clients is, number one, fewer and fewer things throw them out of their window of tolerance, meaning their window of tolerance is getting bigger and bigger, so that that thing that used to trigger them so much, like they're totally fine now when they experience that. But also in those moments when, let's say you get in a car accident, once you're back to safety, ideally with a regulated nervous system, when we do experience a stressor, we're able to, once we're outside of that stressor, return to peace and safety.
Yeah.
What very often happens is when we have a chronically dysregulated system because of so much unresolved stuff, we'll return to, maybe we leave that accident, but we're safe in our home, but we continue to feel agitated. Sometimes, honestly, I think people can stay in a dysregulated place for weeks, where they just cannot get back to that safe place. And so as we process some of the deeper roots of it, and a car accident is an example of more of like an acute stressor. But when we process some of the deeper emotional wounds and trauma that caused chronic nervous system dysregulation in the first place, that is what starts to really expand that window of tolerance and allow us to return within our window so much quicker. And what I want to add on to this is why looking at the roots of that nervous system dysregulation are so important, because there are so many wonderful techniques we can use today, right now, to give our nervous system signs that we're safe. And that's wonderful. And that's especially wonderful if we're in like a very acute state of stress. Something happened that has caused a stress, and we want to let our body, our mind know, actually we're safe, even though that was a scary experience.
Yeah. Your body knows something, your mind knows something else, that we need to kind of bridge that gap with the actual reality of what's happening.
Yes. The distinction here is if you're noticing that you are chronically in a place of anxiety or chronically in a place of dissociation and lethargy and brain fog and poor memory issues, that's a sign that there is probably something much deeper feeding that stress state. And so if we're just doing these simple nervous system techniques, I do think it can give us some release and a little bit more flexibility. But I really believe that we have to go back and look at whatever created this dysregulation in the first place. So that we can let our subconscious know that thing that started this whole spiral, that's over. I'm safe from that now. Yeah.
And we can complete that cycle, that trauma cycle, because oftentimes we are stuck because the original trauma, the cycle was not complete. Like we need to kind of close that circle. What I wanted to say also is that sometimes I help people understand what nervous system soothing techniques that they need at the moment, with, like identifying what nervous system state they're in, so that we can go back to regulation. But going back to regulation is that so we can look at the core wound from from the critical thinking brain, because as we were talking about at the beginning of the episode, once we are triggered, your critical thinking brain is shut off. And that is part of the whole survival mechanism. Your body is like, we don't need to think right now. We're being chased by a bear. I don't think you need to sit down and think critically about how the bear is feeling. So we're going to send all the energy and whatever system is going to support you to run away from it or hide from it.
Mhm.
That's why we really cannot think critically when we're in a nervous system response. So once we use these soothing techniques, that's not the end all and be all. We use
Right.
them so that we can go back to a regulated place, use that critical thinking brain, that logical brain, so that we can go back and start healing. That's where we access these, from that perspective. So how does this relate to money, Leigh Ann? Let's talk about common money dysregulation symptoms and see if they're fight, flight, fawn, or freeze responses. I like playing that game.
The 4 Fs.
Yeah.
I think that probably any one of these states could be a route for someone and their money habits.
Yeah. And it's not like one is this, like not overspending is flight. It doesn't necessarily come to that. It really is so deeply linked to the core wound, isn't it?
Yes. And so I like to kind of work backwards from that place of, can we identify the core wound?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly can we identify the beliefs that we created around that?
Yeah.
But can we also now bring in this nervous system lens and identify in the moment of that wounding, what stress response did my brain go to get me through that experience?
Yeah.
And I love this because it can be so helpful. So for example, for me with the overspending with food, it was a freeze response where I needed soothing. I know I shouldn't be spending so much money on food right now, but I need the soothing so bad that I'm just going to dissociate, check out, turn it off. None of this is real and buy it anyways.
Yeah.
Once we can identify what is the nervous system state that we are in when we are engaging in this pattern that we're trying to break, then we can go, okay, here are some very targeted strategies I can use to support my nervous system in that moment. And then to your point, then go do some of the deeper processing as to those core wounds and those beliefs, et cetera. But so for example, hyper arousal states like fight or flight, we want to do things that are actually going to be a little bit more soothing and slow and calming.
Slow. Oh my God. Nervous system loves slow.
Yes.
Slow is so good. Yep.
And so it's things like actually turning on music that has a slower tempo, making your breathing a little bit slower, particularly your exhale, making sure your exhale is longer than your inhale.
I'm doing it right now just because you said so.
Going on a walk, but making sure you're walking slowly, almost like forcing yourself to walk slowly a little bit. Whereas with hypoarousal states, the freeze and the fawn, we want to do things that are a little bit more uplifting, a little bit more boppy, maybe, because with that, it's kind of that like, it actually is the slowness. It's the sluggishness and the lethargy. And so we might want to actually put on some music that's a little bit more upbeat. Yeah. We might want to go on a walk, but actually walk a little bit faster, try and do a fast walk.
Yeah.
Do maybe a little bit of exercise that's getting our body moving. So that can help us when we're in those states. So for example, for me, now when I still maybe sometimes get that urge of like, oh, I'm feeling nervous or something, I want to go buy this really good food, but my conscious brain goes, actually, I've maybe reached my quota for eating out this month, but I'm still kind of feeling that urgency within. For me, it tends to drop into sadness. Like I'm sad and I want to soothe it.
Yeah.
And so I go, okay, I don't want to dissociate and check out and just buy this. Let me use one of these techniques that helps with hypoarousal states. Let me get out and walk as I'm thinking through it. Now I'm like, I so quickly am able to use a more expansive soothing technique, which is what I like to call them, so that I can get into more of the deeper processing. But I think it's important to note that, especially if you're just starting this work, for you in the beginning, it might look like I just need to give myself that new soothing technique. I can't quite shift into the processing yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's fine.
I can't shift into the processing yet on my own. I'm only able to do that with a practitioner.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to note because the processing itself may be very triggering.
That's
And so,
very true. Very true. The processing itself, that's where I was saying that sometimes we need some hand holding and a safe space, because the processing is a really dark corridor in your subconscious sometimes. And you certainly cannot do it on your own. I mean, there are some things that you can, but yeah, don't force yourself.
Right. And so it's wonderful that we have these techniques that, again, I like to call them expansive patterns.
Yeah.
Because, so let's say normally when I'm feeling down or low or stressed, I want to go buy myself a really delicious meal. Now, when I get that urge, I know, okay, what's the root to this?
Mm-hmm.
The root to this is I'm feeling down, I'm feeling unseen, unheard, unprotected.
Yeah.
I want to feel that through this. And so now I can bring in a more expansive pattern of how can I soothe this wound in a different way? For me now, it's I go on a walk and I acknowledge I'm feeling unseen. I'm feeling unheard. I'm feeling unprotective.
Yeah.
The acknowledgement is a really big part of it.
Gosh,
and
it's such a big part.
It's so
you wouldn't even imagine how important it is, but so many times we just override our feelings. But that acknowledgement piece is massive, massive.
It's such a good place to start. No matter what state you're in, hyperarousal, hypo, the acknowledgement is such a good place to start because it makes us feel seen.
Yeah.
Whether it's like, I'm pissed, I'm angry, I'm so upset, I'm overwhelmed, I'm scared, I want to run away, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. The acknowledgement, honestly, sometimes you'll do that acknowledgement and you'll be like, oh, I'm back.
Oh, okay, now I'm
back in my window. Yeah. I'm good. But to your point, instead of soothing that wound with the food, I can soothe that wound with some of these nervous system techniques.
Yeah.
And then go do some deeper processing. For me, I can now do it in the moment. But again, for a lot of people, it might just start with, we soothe that wound and we use this techniques to get us to our next appointment or session with the professional that we're working with.
Yeah.
To then dive into and do the deeper emotional processing.
I agree. And especially if this is for if you're in the beginning of your healing journey, but then later on, after you've done a lot of processing and healing, sometimes all I need is that acknowledgement, like, oh, I'm going back to that pattern. I wonder what's going on, and that acknowledgement, and just like remembering part of the things that I've done with my own coach. That sometimes it's enough. Sometimes it just is an indication that there's more to it that wasn't ready to come out at the time. Mm-hmm. So it really is nuanced. There's no like one, this is the formula to do it. And that's why I love talking to you, because you're not a formula person. I will never, ever, bring in a formula kind of person to speak to my audience, because I don't believe in formulas. It's so nuanced. We're all different, right?
Yeah.
And like, if we talk about that overspending pattern, and you say for you, it's more of a freeze response, but it's not necessarily that for somebody else. I see a lot of overspending patterns as a fawn response. So a people-pleasing response, wanting to fit in, right? That's the root of that pattern of not being able to feel belonging as a child. Therefore, as an adult, all you want to do is fit in. So you buy people presents, or you buy everyone dinner, or, that is the root of that overspending. It could be a flight response. It could be a fight response. So it is so nuanced, and no size fits all. So
yeah. And I think just to make it practical for the listeners, start with what you know, which tends to be the pattern. Mm-hmm. What is your current pattern with money? Mm-hmm. Can we acknowledge it? Mm-hmm. Can we start with the acknowledgement? But then it can be really helpful to tune into, okay, when I'm in the midst of this pattern, what do I feel like? What are some of the deeper emotions going on? Am I feeling flighty and frenzied and panicked? Mm-hmm. Or am I feeling like so sad and low and down that I want to pick myself up with this thing? And that will help you start to identify what might be the stress state or the nervous system state that you tend to be in. Mm-hmm. And then you can bring in specific techniques to support you in that moment, again, to then be able to start to identify more and more. But there's so much we can do at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And I think that's, both of us are so much into that empowerment of, you can start to piece this together. You can start to become your own detective today. Mm-hmm. Most of us need additional help. I did too. We all do. Yeah. I use EVOX on myself. So most of us need that little external detective because it can be so exhausting to do it for ourselves. But working backwards from it can oftentimes help you start to get to the root of it. But I do think if you're just doing it on your own without a practitioner, it's just going to take longer, really. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's going to take way longer than it needs to.
Yeah. Are there any books that you would recommend to people when they start on that healing journey, especially with, with the nervous system work and, all that? What are your favorite books?
I love the one you're reading now. I read it earlier this year, which is Call of the Wild by Kimberly Ann Johnson. That one's so heavy on the nervous system component. And it really puts it into great terms. I love it. And she is so much about creating safety within.
Yeah.
Which is so good.
Tone. Yeah.
But understanding what else might be playing a role. There's a couple books I really love. Of course, The Body Keeps the Score, which I think so many of us know about now.
That book. But, wow.
Another one there's two that came out this year that I think are so profound. One of them is The Anatomy of Anxiety by Dr. Ellen Vora. And this is right up both of our alleys because she's talking so much about the physiological factors that can contribute to anxiety, but also the deeper core wounds.
That book is, it's on my list. You've also interviewed her on your podcast. So
it's just so good. And she's such a soothing person to listen to. So, and then the other one, and this is something that I think is so prevalent and isn't talked about a lot, is there's a book called Emotional Inheritance by Dr. Galit Atlas. And this is about generational trauma. Yeah. And how generational trauma can be affecting us, how it can be passed on, but how it can be affecting our patterns, our beliefs, emotionally, physically, behaviorally, all those different things. And that's definitely another lens that I like to bring in on occasion when I suspect that there's some generational trauma contributing.
Yeah, especially with that scarcity wound. That is a lot of times that scarcity is generational, especially when we think about our parents, our parents and their parents and what they had to survive.
Yes.
They literally were living in scarcity environments, bread queues and bread lines and like all of the things that happened that we're just carrying around with us as, as the descendants of that generation. Anything else you would like to add to our listeners today, Leigh Ann?
I think the message I love to make sure people hear is your mind, your body is not trying to sabotage you.
Oh my God. Yes. 100%. Y'all, seriously, say that again. It just turns me on. Say it one more time.
Your mind and your body are not trying to sabotage you. It's only ever trying to protect you.
Yes.
And when we can look at it from that perspective of, okay, this is trying to protect me. So what is it trying to protect me from? We can start to dig deeper, but it releases us from so much anger, frustration,
blame,
ourselves, shame that we have towards ourselves, which
I know that's the worst.
We feel enough of that. We feel enough of that from other people. We don't need to feel that way towards ourselves.
Yeah.
And I have found so much that when we shift that perspective and go, this is a protective pattern. It's a belief in my subconscious that is trying to protect me. It actually gives us so much gratitude of thank you so much for trying to protect me for this old wound. Now I want to start to protect you and hear you and get to some of the deeper roots of it.
And it brings in that angle of compassion. That's such an essential ingredient to the healing journey. Compassion.
Yes.
Yeah.
We don't need to, like I said, we don't need to beat ourselves up. It doesn't do us any good. It's kind of like what we said at the beginning. When it's something that's right, there's so much ease. That comes with it. And I do believe healing can be graceful and easeful. Yes, there can be moments of discomfort and pain and sorrow that comes up, but when you found a practitioner you resonate with, and when you're giving yourself so much love and support and grace, the healing can happen so much smoother, gentler, and quicker, truly, than I think we ever really believed was possible.
Yeah, so true. It's the safety. When your body feels safe, when you viscerally feel that safety, regardless of how many letters the practitioner has after their name, it's that visceral feeling of safety that will begin that healing journey for you. So where can people find you, Leigh Ann, if you know they don't live in in California?
Yes.
I am desperate for an EVOX session now after all the wonderful things that you said, but I'm a little bit far away to just swing by.
Well, I do remote sessions with it, but it's a little, there's just a little bit more logistics to it because clients do need to purchase the hand cradle and then download the software onto Windows compatible computers. So, but I have clients in Italy, in Canada.
Beautiful. Wow.
So there's actually not a lot of barriers other than some people only have Mac computers, which I get. I was a Macer before I got this, but you can find me on Instagram. My personal is Leigh Ann Lindsey. And then I'm also on Instagram through the business, which is so much more emotional, nervous system wellness focused, which is at The Accrescent, ACCRESCENT. I'm sure, Nadine, you'll put it in the show notes.
I'll pop all these into the show notes for sure.
And then, of course, online at theaccrescent.com, which is where you can learn so much more about EVOX and read testimonials and
your podcast.
And the podcast, The Accrescent podcast, which is, again, if you go to Instagram or the website, you'll be able to find the podcast.
And I'll be linking some of the episodes that we mentioned earlier in the episode.
You have to link yours because they were so good.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Leigh Ann. It's been a pleasure as usual, but you know, the tables were turned this time and I was the one interviewing, and wow, I'm so glad that we were able to share the richness of your experience and knowledge with our listeners today.
That was so fun. Thank you so much. I feel like we could have gone on a million tangents.
Oh, so. You'll be back on the podcast for sure.
I love it. I hope so. Thank you.